Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Reeder, Adult Services Librarian with the Pasadena Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us this early evening on this very interesting program titled The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, presented by the author, Libby Copeland. We're going to start in about 2 minutes, as we have a large group that's joining us. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this early evening. I'm Christine Reeder, Adult Services Librarian, and I'm delighted that you're here today so that I can introduce you to Libby Copeland, the author of The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. We have the book in our library collection. It is a book, an ebook, and an audiobook. As you probably all know, we have a new catalog system, and if you need any assistance with that, please call the library's chat line, and we'll be very glad to assist you with that. Today's program, as you know, is so interesting and so important and so much interest in it that we are recording it. It will be placed on the Pasadena Public Library's YouTube. We will not be showing anyone's photo or name. And that is why the chat questions are private with me. I will be asking your questions at the end of the program. So at this time, could you please take a few moments and make sure you are all muted. So while we are closed, the library has lots and lots of opportunities for you to connect with us. We have programs for your enjoyment and enrichment, and we have numerous services that are available. Our digital services are open 24/7 on our library webpage, and our monthly off-the-shelf keeps you informed as to all of our events. I'm sure you all know that because that's how you all signed up to come today. Library staff is available to chat with you and provide reference services. And as I said, assist with our new catalog. We are providing contactless curbside service at all of our sites except Hill and Villa Park. You may place your orders on hold and come and pick them up. So at this time, I want to introduce to you Libby Copeland. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March 2020 by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomena of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? So I have a series of questions that I'm going to be asking Libby, and I'll introduce you to Libby right now. Hello, Libby.
Hi there. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Christine. That was really nice.
Oh, thank you so much. Now, Libby's going to tell you how you can get a copy of her book if you'd actually like to own it yourself. And she has a newsletter. We will be sending that out to all of our participants as well, so that you will actually have the link.
Sure, yeah. So I'm so excited to talk about the book, and for sure there's also I'm trying to support independent bookstores as I talk about the book, and there's a bookstore near my house where I can go and sign copies. So if you want personalized copies for yourself or to give as a gift, I will drop in the link how you can get that. The bookstore near my house in New York will send all over the country, and I also have a newsletter, and I'm going to be sending out some free copies of the book this week. I'm doing a kind of a lottery, so if you want to sign up for that, I will drop that also in the chat for everyone. But I'm excited to talk to you about DNA and genealogy and the family and all the things that we're learning.
Thank you so much. Well, how did you come to write this book, Libby? What got you fascinated into this subject?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years, and I worked half my career at the Washington Post before I became a freelancer. And at the Washington Post, there's a lot of stories that you do that are about really short amounts of time with really important people. So you spend an hour interviewing a celebrity and you're trying to wring some interesting news out of them, or you're on a campaign trail with a presidential candidate and you're trying to figure out some angle that no one has written and some feeling of intimacy with someone who's whose every word is carefully considered. And the stories that I always loved to do at the Post were different kinds of stories, were kind of intimate stories of people who were sort of ordinary people who found themselves in remarkable circumstances, and questions about their self-definition, the ways they thought about themselves, their motivations, their psychologies. And so after I left the Post and I started writing more about science and the way we think about ourselves and questions about human behavior and the cognitive sciences, I was also at that same time in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post, who I still write for them. And we started talking about DNA testing because we were really interested in this phenomenon where, there are all these people testing, and we sort of know who we are going in. And for some significant minority of people, when they test, they discover that their narrative of themselves, their identity, or their understanding of their family, or their understanding of their family's history or their ancestry is actually not the same as their DNA results. And what do those people do when they make those discoveries? I was really interested in that kind of jarring disconnect, and this idea that sometimes people in their 50s and 60s are then prompted to go back and reconsider who they are and almost rethink and rewrite their own personal biographies. And that seemed like a really interesting kind of connection between technology, a technology that maybe we don't even expect to have this particular consequence, and psychology. And not just on a personal level, but really this is something that changes families, and this is something that changes our culture as a whole. So I was in conversation with my editor. We decided we would have me write about it. I found this really amazing story that I wanted to tell. And I wrote the story for the Washington Post, and it ran in 2017. It got this kind of viral pickup where I started getting hundreds and hundreds of emails from people saying, that story was really good, but now let me tell you about my DNA surprise. Let me tell you about the secrets that I found in my own family. Let me tell you about the reality of my own genetic origins and how they are different from what I was told. And these stories, I started getting on the phone with people, and they were so moving. They were so, honestly, so profound. And I thought, wow, this is not a story that's limited to a single demographic, a single age group, a single community. This is an American story. This is a story about us finding out who we really are and what we do with that information when we find it out. This is the story of countless ordinary Americans in extraordinary circumstances. And I started to write the book. That's how it started.
Well, it's a fascinating book. And in case everyone hasn't seen the cover of the book or hasn't had a chance to read it, it is a beautiful book as well. It has a great table of contents and a wonderful index. So as you read it and you want to find something further in it, or you remember something, it's a fascinating book and very easy to read. So the story about Alice Collins Fleabrook, is that how you see it, or Fleabrook?
Very, very close. It's Playbook, yeah.
Okay, frames your story. So without spoiling the story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing and how you actually selected her?
Yeah, so Alice is a fascinating woman. She was the subject of my Washington Post story. And if you want to read her story in miniature, you can Google her. You can Google Libby Copeland and Alice and DNA and Washington Post, and you can read sort of a mini version. It actually ran at great length in newspaper terms. They gave me a lot of space, but it's very, very short compared to the space that you can have in a book. Her story was absolutely fascinating. And one of the pleasures of writing it and being able to expand it for the book was that I was able to travel out to Washington State, where she lives, and spend time with her and sort of study her incredible mind and do historical research to understand her story and then expand it and tell a lot of other stories along the way. So she has a very unusual DNA testing story. It's not your typical story, but it kind of contains within it many others, which is why I thought it was such a great story to tell. It's a gripping kind of page turner, a kind of existential whodunit. And the reason I chose her story is because it is so fascinating. And I knew that, I was writing a book of science for a mainstream audience, and science can be a difficult slog. I am not a scientist. I understand sort of the barriers to writing and reading about science. It can be somewhat dry. So I wanted a narrative that would kind of pull the reader through the story in a way that they would find it so compelling that they couldn't put it down. Alice in 2012 decides to take a DNA test. Now, DNA testing has been around for just over 20 years, but in 2012 was really an inflection point when the kind of DNA testing that we're all familiar with, you've all seen the ads, find out who you are, get that pie chart that tells you how Irish you are. That 2012 was a moment when that kind of DNA testing was really coming on the scene and starting to grow. And that's when Alice, who was a lifelong, I shouldn't say lifelong, but a longtime genealogist at that point, that's when she decided to delve into DNA to enhance her genealogical research, to break through those brick walls that genealogists are continually frustrated by. But Alice, like most people going in, thought she knew what she was going to find, and this was just going to enhance her understanding. She believed that she was Irish on both sides. She had grown up in a large Irish Catholic family. They went to church on Sundays. Both her parents were very steeped in that identity. She kind of had done her genealogical research, so she knew her branches as far back as she could get. And she takes this test through Ancestry. Ancestry Dna at the time was just unveiling their test. In fact, it was still in testing mode. She wasn't even sure how good it was going to be. And she gets that pie chart. And the pie chart, instead of saying that she is entirely, Irish American with a smattering of British Isles and Scottish, which is what she was expecting, tells her that her pie chart is split down the middle, that half of it is this Irish British Isles mix that she's expecting, and the other half is Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, which is a very different genetic signature than someone who's Irish. You kind of can't confuse the two. A scientist can't when they're looking at that kind of genetic level. And at first she thinks, well, they've messed up, right? The test is still in beta. Clearly they're not ready for prime time. And she emails them. She says, you guys got it wrong. I know that I'm Irish. But it turned out, of course, that Alice was one of the first of many, many Americans to come who would learn that the test was not wrong, that it was she who understood the story wrong, right? She had it wrong about herself through no fault of her own. And she embarked on a journey to understand how she'd gotten it wrong and what her true story was. And it took her 2.5 years of daily, full-time, she was retired, deep analytical science work, basically. And she was totally dogged and tireless and very, very smart, and did work that most of us probably we would not have been able to do. We would have thrown up our hands. Why is her story interesting? Because none of the usual explanations explained her situation. That's why she was so compelling. Her story didn't fit the expected patterns. So typically, if you take a DNA test, you spit into a vial, you pay $99, you send it away, you're getting two pieces of information. You're getting your lists of genetic relatives, so the people who tested the same company who matched to you, which they can see through overlapping genetic segments, and you're getting your pie chart, your ethnicity estimate, which is where your ancestors came from, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And typically, if somebody gets a pie chart that's sort of half unexpected ancestry, the explanation is most likely that they are the product of an NPE. And that stands for non-paternity event, or not parent expected. Sometimes it's called MPE, for misattributed parentage experience. It's one of the most common kinds of DNA surprises that you can get. And Alice investigates this because she, of course, figures that is a possibility. But it turns out that is not the explanation in her case. It's none of the theories that she throws out in the very beginning, the more likely scenarios. So she investigates the possibility that she's adopted, which again, you see people, and I tell in my book the story of a woman who finds out at the age of 51 that she is adopted through taking a DNA test. Nobody told her because of stigmas and secrets and assumptions, cultural changes that were prevalent 50 years ago when she came to be. It's not the case that Alice is donor conceived. Again, many people who were conceived by sperm donor decades ago were not told, for a variety of reasons, including the stigma of infertility and the stigma of using a sperm donor, or just because it was considered private. They were not told that they were the product of a sperm donor, and they're finding out in their 60s and 70s that they're not genetically related to their dad, and they don't even have maybe perhaps their parents alive so they can ask them questions about it. And they're learning that a stranger contributed half their genetic material, and they're kind of grappling with that. That's not the explanation for Alice's situation. The last theory that she investigates, which is a contender, is the possibility that her family hid their genetic ancestry. And you see this in stories in America, contemporary America right now, and I tell some of these stories in the book. People who they assimilated or converted or otherwise hid their true genetic ancestry, perhaps as an escape from rampant discrimination. So light-skinned African Americans who chose to pass as white, and they could, and they did not pass down that information as a matter of survival. Jews who converted and, again, didn't converted to Christianity or Catholicism and didn't pass down that information. And you see that people now in this era of DNA testing, they go in sort of saying, well, let me find out a little bit more, about how, how Italian I am. And they're finding that, in fact, I have 12% sub-Saharan African ancestry. And they're wondering, how did that come to be? What stories did I not know? Who knew? And they're rethinking their understanding of their place in this country. But that was not the explanation for Alice either. And the true explanation for her story, I won't reveal it here. If you can look up the Washington Post story if you want to know the ending, or you cannot look it up if you don't want to know. But it turns out to go back 100 years. And it is a kind of a historical mystery. And the pleasure of getting to go back and do that research in the old archives to understand the circumstances of how her mystery came to be was fabulous. I loved it so much because if I wasn't a journalist, I'd be a historian if I could. So anyway, that's sort of the Alice's story is so great because it's a story that contains others. And so as I chose her story to be kind of the spine of the lost family, because what it allows me to do is to tell her story and then leap off to the side to show you what it looks like when you test and discover that you're the product of an NPE, or when you test and discover you're adopted or donor conceived, or that your family hid its genetic ancestry. So it allows me to tell many stories as I'm following that central narrative.
Oh, thank you very much. You spent lots and lots of research as well. So did
Alex.
everyone involved, Alice involved with this. It was 2 years plus of research
Yeah.
for her, very, very dedicated. Um, well, you said that one of the realities of technology advances is that their true impact is hard to anticipate. Is that the case with home DNA, or you've really shown that it already is hard to anticipate because you think you're Irish and you end up to have the Jewish
Yeah.
part or something another?
Exactly. Yeah. I think if you look back at the history of the industry, it helps to kind of understand sort of how far we've come and where we started, right? What were the assumptions? So the first company for DNA testing for ancestry purposes in the United States was started just over 20 years ago. It's a company called Family Tree DNA. They sent out their first test kits in the spring of 2000, just over 20 years ago. And those DNA tests were different. They were looking at DNA along the Y chromosome that males inherit from their fathers, and then also mitochondrial DNA. And that is inherited, everyone inherits it from their mothers and up the matrilineal line. And those kinds of DNA were different. So they're not going to give you that pie chart. They're not going to give you both your maternal and paternal immediate relatives. They're showing you ancient migration paths and your connection to ancient ancestors. And the way that it started was that the founder of Family Tree DNA, one of the co-founders, was a genealogist. He had a particular genealogical question he couldn't answer, and he figured Y-DNA could answer it for him. And so he founded this company really with himself in mind, right? He wanted to be able to take advantage of it, and he figured others would too. But he told me that, the first years of the company, he couldn't get people interested. He would go to genealogical conferences and he would buttonhole people, and he would try to explain how this was going to be useful to their research, and they were not interested. And he would go so far as to shake people's hands and then not let go, but walk backwards to lure them closer to his booth, in hopes that if he could just get them closer to the product, he might be able to make a sale, right? And that's sort of like the first 10 years of the industry. As you see, it's just not growing. And then autosomal DNA, which is the type of DNA that we're all familiar with, comes on the scene. And 23andMe is involved in the market at this point, and Ancestry gets involved. And Ancestry puts a tremendous amount of money into their marketing. In 2016 and 2017, they spent $100 million each year in advertising and marketing. Ancestry did. And I'm probably, everyone on this book talk is familiar with those ads, the 23andMe ads and the Ancestry ads. You find out who you are, figure out your story, become closer to your family. What will you talk about on Thanksgiving dinner table this year? How about your DNA test, right? We all kind of all know those ads, and they're really compelling. And those ads really fueled interest from the casual consumer. So it went from the realm of the serious family historian, the serious genealogical hobbyist, into the world of people who test because it's on sale. They test because they get it as a gift, which is how I got my first DNA test, just kind of casually, and you get it. You don't even necessarily know what it is. Sometimes people are testing, they don't even know that they're getting their lists of genetic relatives. They only know about the pie chart. And so they don't even quite know what they're getting into. And that movement from, people who are sort of steeped in family history and know the kind of, the kind of surprises that it contains, and the historical realities that they may encounter, that leap from that group to kind of the casual consumer brings with it just a kind of a hyper drive, an advancement, and a growth, I would say, in people not quite being prepared for that surprise. When you test, there's a kind of advisory that they give you that's something along the lines of, you may discover unexpected relatives, but I found over and over again, people don't assume that that's going to apply to them. Even if they know that it's a statistical possibility, they don't assume that it's going to apply to them. And I think this is really interesting, not only for those of us who test and not only for those people who get surprises, but really for everyone. And that's because, the act of testing and finding your connection to the immediate past, whether it just enhances your understanding of who you are, or and deepens it, or it offers something that disrupts your understanding of who you are, or changes your understanding of your family. Those that immediacy and that power of revelation is a really big deal for the modern American, right? And it's allowing us to see the past as something that is not so far away, but something that kind of lives inside of us and has this revelatory power and is waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself to us if we choose to test. And that means that there's a lot of kind of reckonings happening right now, reckonings within families on an individual level, and I would argue on a cultural level, about the truth about the past, right? The truth about how we came to be here and all the things, in some cases, that we were not told. And I also think that there are kind of essential human questions that are raised by this, and I can talk more about it. I have to rein myself in because I tend to talk too much, so I won't talk too much on this answering to this one question. But these questions about what is family and what is ethnicity, these are questions that are raised when you test. And even if you don't choose to test, that we've all kind of thought about, right? What am I? What makes me me? Who would I have been if I was raised by that family across the street? And those essential human questions we engage with incredibly deeply when we take a DNA test, but they are relevant to every human being, I think.
Well, those are fascinating questions. So we'd like to hear more about them if you want to talk about them. Or here's another question. What did your research reveal about the implications of home DNA testing for the African American community?
Yeah.
Given the history of slavery in America.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The challenge and the promise of doing traditional genealogy without DNA combined is that there are records, or relatively fewer records, depending on the community you come from. And there's a kind of a direct relationship between the presence of records about your community in the past and how powerful that community was, right? Records, there's a quote in the book, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's like, records tend to coalesce around power. And so if your community was illiterate, if they weren't considered worthy of being written about, if their records were not preserved, if there was a fire, if there was migration and war, all those factors can affect whether or not you are able to do your genealogical research and get back further than just a few generations. And so for those Americans who descended from people who were enslaved, they will often hit brick walls. And one of those brick walls, for instance, is the federal census. If you go back before 1870, you can't find the name of your enslaved ancestor in the federal census because they were not named when they were enslaved. They were just tick marks in a box. So how do you use DNA to get around that? That's sort of the promise and the power of DNA for some disenfranchised communities. And so I write in the book about this. I write about how some African-American genealogists have been able to use DNA testing combined with genealogical research to get back really pretty far. So there's a man in my book I write about, he uses DNA, the ethnicity estimate gives him access to understanding where several branches of the family came from before they were brought over in chains. But the real kind of aha moment for him is the finding of a contemporary cousin in the DNA database. And that cousin lives in Africa. And that cousin he connects with, and that cousin is able to tell him, because they kind of descend from an ancestor who lived before his ancestors were brought over as slaves. That ancestor, contemporary cousin, is able to tell him, here are the people that you and I descend from. They are the Fulani. And this man, T.L. Dixon, the genealogist, is able to look up the Fulani community. He's able to see the language that they spoke, the customs, the foods they ate, how they traveled, where they lived. Incredible access to information that he would not have otherwise had. So there's a number of stories like that in the book. I tell another story about somebody who descends from people who are enslaved, who's able to trace back the life of a particular slave ancestor using DNA combined with genealogy. So there are complications to DNA, which I also talk about in the book, to our conception of biological difference. And that's a really complex topic that I tried to get my arms around in the book. It's not a totally kind of uncomplicated relationship that we have when we think about how DNA informs identity, and we have to be careful to not kind of conflate that pie chart with identity, because ethnicity is kind of the lived experience. It's not just your DNA, but it's also important to kind of look at the stories of those communities that, without DNA would basically be, the past is a black box to them. And this is that kind of empowering ability to, to get around that black box and to kind of, it's kind of an equalizing force.
Wow. Lots and lots of research, and fascinating how that genealogist was able to locate his relatives in Africa. And
yeah, I mean, you also have
all that research. And
absolutely, I mean, you also have stories of people who are finding relatives they thought died during the Holocaust, or descendants of branches they did not know existed. In my family, we found, because I'm Ashkenazi Jewish on my mother's side, we found a descendant of a branch we did not know survived the Holocaust in Ukraine. And that descendant, who is my mother's second cousin, eventually grew up in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know the full story. We've only spoken to him once, but his whole branch lived through pogroms, presumably lived through World War II and the rise of the USSR. And they lived long enough to, for him to grow up in Ukraine, for him to move to Israel, and then for him to move to Brooklyn and be on the phone with us. Right. And sometimes these are things that the paper records just can't answer. Sometimes, it's just kismet. Like for us, we just found them in the database. Other times people know that they're looking for someone and they're uniting. There's a wonderful genealogist who talks about uniting two first cousins who, didn't know that they both survived the Holocaust, and they're now united late in life. So there are all these kind of amazing stories of how DNA can kind of, provide like a kind of act as a kind of an equalizer when the other sources of information have failed us.
Wow. So people want to find relatives from the Holocaust or some type of a terrible event in the world, a war event. What about if you really, if you are white, if you're really African American, but you've lived your life as white, because you hear about the two sisters or brothers or two children in the same family or cousins, and one can pass as white and one can pass as black, and they go about their different ways, and they really don't want to reveal their background. What's the sociological and psychological effect of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's truly, the moment that we're living in, I don't have the words for it. I think it is such a big deal. There's a man in my book that I write about whose name is Rosario, and he is descended from biracial grandparents. Well, I should say his mother is biracial. Now, he didn't know this until he started getting into DNA and genealogy. He was told that he was Sicilian. His mother told him that, and she told him that because she had grown up in a rural white community in Vermont, and she had experienced discrimination because she was a biracial child. Her father was Black, her mother was white. They had two children together, and they were not married. And in fact, her father was put in jail for the crime of adultery, which may or may not have been related to the fact that he was Black. Right, the white grandmother was not put in jail, but the Black grandfather was. So she didn't tell her child that he was actually Black. She said he was Sicilian, and he embraced this Sicilianness to the point where he changed his name to something Italian. He learned to sing opera. He converted to Catholicism. He married an Italian-American woman. He proposed to her in Italy. I mean, he was very attached to this Italian identity. And when he started getting into DNA and genealogy, that was when he realized he was not Sicilian at all. That in fact, he was 18% sub-Saharan African. And, you know, he went back to his mom and he said, "Did you know?" And she said, "Yeah, I was trying to protect you, you know." And Rosario's story is amazing. And I followed in a couple of chapters in the book because, you know, I talked to him in 2018 and, you know, and then I talked to him again 6 months later, and I talked to him again in 2019. And then I talked to him again when I was fact checking the book, and I still keep in touch with him. And, you know, his story changes in the sense that he's processing it. So, you know, his take at one point may be more raw, and then as he grows into his new sense of identity, you know, maybe you know, his emotions are a little less raw, but he has a greater understanding now that he's done genealogical research of that Vermont community. He kind of deepens his understanding as he goes, and he's set onto this kind of this, I guess I would call it like a historical writing of wrongs or writing of the past, where he's launched himself into understanding this Vermont community where his mom came from, right? Because it used to be filled with African Americans, and then they all left. And how were they made to leave, or how were they pushed out? And how did his mom's family come to be? And how was she sort of shunned, right? All this stuff that he wants to understand. And that is, in microcosm for him, actually the bigger story of America in the middle of the 20th century, and for interracial couples, right? So he's, through his genealogical research and his research into his family and this one community, really trying to understand America and his place in it. And I know if I talked to him today, you know, he would have fresh insights for me because he's continually processing it. And as I found this to be true with people I interviewed, just generally along the lines, you know, whether it's somebody like Rosario or it's somebody like Jackie, who discovered that she, you know, was, or I'm sorry, I should say Linda, who discovered that she was adopted, or Lori, who discovered that she was a product of a non-paternity event, or Jackie, who knew but, you know, tried to connect with her half siblings. You know, that it is a lifelong process of reckoning. It is a kind of lifelong process of processing emotionally. It's not something where you take a test and you discover something and a month later you have a reunion with your family, your long lost genetic relatives, and then it's all over. It's something that lasts potentially for the rest of your life. And it's a really big deal. And it's a really big deal in the mental health community at this point too. So it's a big story and it's happening quietly and in kind of behind closed doors in families across America.
Yes, I would say the psychological and sociological impact is absolutely huge. And it really is about how everyone has immigrated throughout this country and moved from place to place to the next place. So most of everyone here that's listening tonight is from California. So of course the big case in California was the Golden State Killer. And it took a long time for them to really solve that. And they were able to do it by the genealogy research, but it wasn't a normal way,
right.
In the sense that they had to really dig a lot and get a lot of permission from different of these companies to give them the information. So are you finding that the police and detectives are using this more and more to help solve these crimes? Is that going to assist in all that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Barbara Ray Venter, who's the civilian genetic genealogist who helped solve the Golden State Killer case, has estimated that it has been used in 200 cases thus far since the Golden State Killer. Those are mostly cold cases. They're mostly homicides and sexual assaults, but not entirely. And there's kind of questions about a slippery slope, you know, if it's used in lesser crimes, or if it becomes used in lesser crimes, where are the guidelines around how we're supposed to use this and when we're not allowed to use this? That case was interesting because, in fact, the law enforcement did not get permission. And there was an LA Times piece that came out in December, which you can read if you want. That's like the true untold story of the DNA, the Golden State Killer capture. And there was some amount of kind of, using this against privacy policies or terms and conditions, or terms and conditions that really hadn't been defined at that point, because people in power didn't see it as coming. But at this point, I think what's interesting about the Golden State Killer case is a few things. One is that that the ability to use DNA, autosomal DNA in a consumer database to find someone, particularly someone who's not in the database, has been used by genetic genealogists and people in the adopted community and the donor conception community for many, many years. So this was not new. It was only new in its application, but the techniques were things that citizen scientists innovated. They developed this. And they developed it because in many states, people who are adopted do not have access to their original birth certificates, which means they can't learn the identity of their birth parents, which means they can't have information that many, many people feel is very important to their own identity. And so they've figured out how to kind of triangulate information based on genetic relatives. And this is an important point. You can discover the identity of someone who is not in the database. If you are looking for your genetic father and he never took a test, you can still discover his identity. You need a second cousin, ideally, maybe some third cousins if you don't have a second cousin. But at this point, the databases are so large, there's a very good possibility that it won't be difficult at all. You might be able to just simply find a half sibling, and that's easy enough. And that means, because there are so many people in the databases, there's over 35 million people in the databases, the vast majority of them American, that means we are all implicated, right? You may choose not to take a DNA test because you have privacy concerns. If there's a family secret in your immediate circle of a genetic nature, it's coming out whether or not you choose to test. It may be something about you, and it's coming out whether or not you choose to test, right? It's not a matter of if, but when. You don't need to test in order to discover it, potentially. And so that is another reason why I think it's really important we talk about DNA testing, because increasingly, it's not a choice to opt out. And the questions that swirl, the privacy questions that swirl around law enforcement use, also are connected to these questions of, opting in and opting out, and whether you choose to test, and is it right that people's DNA can be used in a way that they didn't consent to. At this point, for the most part, it's not the major DNA databases that are being used in this way, but some smaller ones. Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. 23andMe and Ancestry have said that they'll fight this kind of use because they're trying to protect the privacy of their consumers. And so you're seeing a kind of a split now between the major databases that want to kind of maintain relationships with they don't want to scare consumers away. And smaller ones that are now working hand in hand with the FBI and with law enforcement for those users who opt in to solve these really old cases, in some cases from the 50s and 60s. In some cases, these are serial murderers. So it's really an interesting moment to kind of be watching. And I think it's only going to continue to be interesting, and it's only going to continue to grow.
Oh, well, it's very important to solve those crimes from the 50s and 60s. And if you have a way to do it that works out, I think it's very important to do it. But apparently more than 35 million people have taken the DNA test. Would you say that America's reached a tipping point?
Yeah.
Are people still interested in doing it? Because the law enforcement, they want to use it to solve these crimes, but if everybody gets scared and doesn't do the DNA, their amount of information slows.
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly is a tipping point in the sense that at this point, if you test, you're going to find many, many cousins, and it's going to make your genealogical research better. And it's also going to mean that if you are somebody who was looking for a biological parent, looking for a long lost older sister, trying to find a first cousin, right, you're much more likely to find them because the databases are simply bigger. It used to be that you would test, and if you were lucky, you found a second cousin. If you were, for instance, trying to find out your birth mother's identity. Nowadays, that's not even a big deal to find a second cousin, right? It's so common. Ancestry at this point says if you test with them, you will on average discover 50,000 genetic cousins in their database, 50,000. Think about that. I mean, the vast majority of those people are not people whose names you know, but they might be fourth, fifth cousins. They're in the database and they share overlapping genetic segments with you. And that's absolutely amazing. I know your face is like, what? It wasn't like that before. And so, yeah, I think, so the question of people testing less is probably less relevant to the law enforcement issue than it is to the industry as a whole, right? Because the law enforcement, the pool of people whose DNA is being used to solve cold cases has always been relatively small. And it's kind of goes up and goes down depending on the policies of a particular company and you know, sort of what how they want to treat their users' data and how the users feel about it, whether they opt in or opt out and that kind of thing. And it's only, for the most part, 2 databases that are being used this way. But the privacy issues may be affecting the fact that there has been a slowdown on the whole, because even though Ancestry and 23 are, as far as we know, not being used for law enforcement, that case kind of has underscored concerns for people. And people they are concerned about privacy. They are concerned about ways this could be used. There's members of the African American community who are concerned about bias in the way that this is used. So, you know, you sort of see those issues cropping up. But I think probably the larger issue for this slowdown has to do with the fact that so many early adopters who had an interest in DNA testing for family research purposes and had the $99 to spend have tested. And some of them have tested in multiple places. My DNA is in 3 databases at this point, right? Because I got into it. But, you know, at a certain point, you kind of you're tapped out of that pool. And so what you're seeing is the companies moving towards health-related testing, you know, testing to find out if you're at risk of a particular gene that, you know, if you have a particular gene that puts you at higher risk of a particular type of cancer, testing to see if you're at higher risk of early onset Alzheimer's, things like that. And so you're sort of seeing a shift in that direction.
Well, that would be a very valuable shift. And a lot of people probably really want to know that, whether they're possibly going to have Alzheimer's or some other type of other disease. What about people who haven't been tested, that all of a sudden, have you come across it where someone has been called on the phone or sent a letter from someone and they really don't want to talk about it? They don't really want to know anything.
Yeah, I mean, the bulk of the stories in my book are kind of these stories of like families and how they grapple with it, right? How do you write a letter to your genetic father? This is a question that people think about and talk about. Do you, is it an email? Is it a letter? If it's a letter, is it a certified letter? Can you send him a note over Facebook Messenger? Will he see it if you do? Because by the time you figured out your biological father's identity, you know, he may not have tested, but you can easily figure it out in many cases. Then you kind of sleuth him out a little bit. You learn a little bit about him. You look him up online. You know, we all live lots of digital breadcrumbs about ourselves. It's not hard to find out his politics, where he lives, if he has other children. Probably fairly easy to get a contact information for him. Maybe you can get an email for him. And then how do you construct the email, right? What are you asking for? How much information are you giving? How emotional do you make it? For the most part, the people who are approaching their genetic relatives, I found, are they want to be accepted and they want to be loved, and they are often have just discovered their own true genetic origins, and they're a little bit you know, their emotions are a little raw, and they want to know who their genetic relatives are, and they may want relationships with them. They certainly want to be acknowledged in many cases if they're reaching out. On the other side are the people who say that, let's take this situation of the genetic father. Maybe he knew he had a child, maybe he didn't. You know, there's a guy in my book who's in his 50s. He discovers that he helped conceive a child when he was 16 in high school. He did not even remember being with his girlfriend, right? Consummating that relationship. So his first response is, this is like some sort of weird scam. He gets the note over Facebook and he thinks, well, this is just some sort of weird scam, right? How is she going to, try and get something out of me? And then he logs onto Ancestry and he sees that she's there. She's matching him. He had taken a test and it's not a scam. And he winds up receiving her with open arms, and other men that I write about delete their kids, or they take a phone call and they say, I can't tell my daughter and my wife about this. I can't have a relationship with you. This is going to be really bad for my marriage. Perhaps they conceived that child outside of their marriage when they were married. So the circumstances of how that child came to be can be, depending on the circumstances, can be very threatening to a family's sacred narratives, to their relationships, and to trust between, say, a parent and a child. If you raised a child and then they're suddenly discovering that you had another child, right, at the same time, it's making them question their loyalties to you, to their mom. I like to say, for each person who tests and discovers a surprise, there's 8 to 10 people who are affected. So if I take a test and I discover I'm the product of a non-paternity event, right, I'm not genetically related to my dad, that doesn't just have implications for me and for him. It has implications for my mom too, right? My mom and my dad's relationship. And he's going to say to her, how did this happen, right? And now I have siblings who I'm now discovering are genetically half siblings to me. They're not my full siblings. And now I'm discovering there's a man out there, a stranger, say 2 states away, who is my genetic father. He contributed half my genetic material. And I might be very curious to see what he looks like. I might be very curious to hear the timbre of his voice, to see his mannerisms, to learn about his family stories, right? And these are all kind of ways in which we access identity through understanding where we came from. Well, this has implications for him. It has implications for his relationship with his wife. And let's say he has children. Now I have 2 new genetic half siblings. So you can see how the single act of me testing has these ripple effects across 2 families, right? Say 8 to 10 people. And let's say none of them tested. It doesn't matter. And that's why I like to think of this as the moment when we have to kind of get in front of these conversations. People sometimes ask me, like, what's your advice? Like, what do you think what should you say? What do you want to say to people before they take a test? I think that's an important question. I think before you test, you should think about whether you're ready to engage and grapple with these questions, with the thinking in mind that as complicated as it is for the people on the other side, for the person who tests, when they discover a truth they weren't expecting, even when it's painful, even when it's complex, they generally say they're glad to know because they want to know the truth, right? But that's not always true for the other people on the other side, and it can be incredibly complicated. But it's limited to say, what is the advice you give to people who test? Because increasingly, it doesn't matter if you test. And so the advice that I like to give, or the sort of thing to think about, is that if you are putting aside DNA testing, if you are from a generation, like an older generation, the generation of the secret keepers, as I like to call them, people who maybe didn't tell their children the truth about their genetic origins for reasons that make 100% sense. And we can't judge people for having made decisions that involve questions of survival and questions of, keeping their family sanctity, intact, decisions made 60 years ago. We can't judge them by contemporary standards. But if you are somebody who made that decision 60 years ago, it may be the moment to start thinking about whether it makes sense to tell your children the truth of their genetic origins if they don't know. And that's because they may find out, whether even, if they take a DNA test at some point, and even if they don't. If your child is donor conceived and they don't know, they might take a DNA test, but their child might take a DNA test. And they could find out that way. And so, and the people that I've interviewed who've had the experience of finding out a revelation about their own origins through a DNA test, they would much rather find out from the lips of the person they know than from a computer screen, because it is it's warmer, it's better, and it's much better for the relationship between parent and child, right? It's much more kind of encouraging a sense of trust if it's coming directly from the parent to the child, rather than you finding it out there, going to the parent saying, why didn't you tell me? And the range of reactions to having not been told can really range. Some people are quite angry. They may understand on a kind of a theoretical level the circumstances that their parents were operating under, but still they can feel that there's a kind of a theft of their own identity. So, for all of those reasons, I like to say that, it might be the moment to start thinking about how you might have a conversation with your child. And there is a growing community of psychologists and professionals, and there's a wonderful genetic counselor out there who can hold people's hands when they go through this process, if that's of interest to you. So.
Whoa. Well, that kind of ties in with one of the questions that we actually have tonight. A lot of articles, research on donor-conceived individuals focuses on sperm donations, including the language used tonight. Does your book contain any stories concerning egg donation? And the question actually goes on. The questioner says, I found out this week that I'm not genetically related to my mother who gave birth to me, grew in her womb, but don't have her genes. An added complication to all that we've heard about.
Wow. That's an incredible story. That's amazing. I was not able to tell stories of egg donation in the book, just because I was sort of cutting material. And it was one of those things where I handed in the book and it was quite long and I had to cut back. And so there were decisions I had to make. And I wound up telling stories of sperm donation and families, one family in particular, where I tell a story from the perspective of one of the children and the donor father, who has 24 genetic children, 2 of whom he raised, the rest of whom were conceived by sperm donation. But that story of the person who just added their comment and question is so amazing. And frankly, I'd love to read that story. I think that the more that we can read of these kinds of stories, the more we can kind of normalize these experiences, and that people who are the early adopters of this technology or have discovered these things in any other way have a lot to teach the rest of us, because as more people enter the databases, despite the slowdown, right, the databases are going to continue to grow, just not at the same rate. And as more people enter these databases and are going to have these experiences, they're going to look to the people who've already had them to know, what to expect, to feel that they're not alone. I think that's really, really important. So I would love to read that story. I'd love to know more about that story. And if that person wants to email me and share their story privately, like, I would love to. On my website, Libby Copeland, I would love to hear it. But that sounds really, really interesting.
It's worth noting that I should have gone on and read more of the chat question, because actually the parents told the person and the triplet, they were triplets, brother and sister, to do exactly what Libby said, to get in front of this. And so the parents told them so that they wouldn't be a surprise.
Thank you.
Exactly what you said to do. Everyone is saying that you're so fascinating, so eloquently spoken and articulated about this very interesting subject. So for everyone that's attending, for more news on DNA, genealogy, and family, and special offers, including book giveaways, sign up for Libby's newsletter at www.libbycopeland.com, and we will send that to everybody who has signed up for tonight. Are there any other questions in the chat? I don't see anything else in the chat. I think you've really answered everything about an absolutely fascinating subject. The one question just came in: are more people informing their children about adopting more now than in the past, or that probably in the 50s and 60s, as you said, that was really more secret or not revealed?
Yes, donor conception.
Now we're much more open.
Yes, and adoption and donor conception, children are much more likely to know the circumstances, and they may, there are also more open adoptions. So children are more likely, or adult children are more likely to know the identities of their birth parents if they're adopted nowadays as well, or at least know more about them.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Libby, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. How you've really delved into this subject increasingly over the years. And when you think about this started 20 years ago, and now where we are now, 20 years later, what would be your advice to everybody that wants to go and get themselves tested?
Yeah, I mean, it's, there are privacy concerns. There are questions about future use of this information, genetic discrimination. So it's a bit complicated, and yet I also am engaging with this as somebody who has tested, right? And as I mentioned earlier, and we have more family stories than just the one I conveyed. It's been kind of incredible to our understanding of ourselves. So I find, it's a complicated, it's not easy to answer. But I would say, it's important to kind of think about these questions and to be prepared, for the possibility that, your own story may not be exactly what you thought, and that you may be kind of undertaking a process of historical excavation, and reckoning, and to be ready for that.
So are you going to write a sequel to this book for the other, everyone else, or more and more people are contacting you all the time
I hear
to find out, they're telling their stories and want your insight about where they should go, because it's not just an easy thing. When you do, I haven't done one of these tests. Do you actually get a list of names and a state, or then you have to go, you're not getting an address?
No, you're not getting a state.
So you've got to do a lot of research afterwards.
Yeah, so you can connect with people and they can kind of choose how much information they want to share with you. They might have a tree, for instance, and you might be able to use that information to understand how you're related to them. That's often very helpful. But it's not as if there's one particular system that uses an email address, but for the most part, you're not getting access to them. You're messaging them through the kind of proprietary messaging system that's on the platform, and they can choose to ignore it, or they happen not to see it, which happens all the time and is the bane of genealogists' existence, those matches that don't write you back. But yeah, it's not as if you can get their phone number and call them up. On the other hand, it's often not that difficult to find out their identity and get their information, as kind of search angels and sleuths can tell you. You can sometimes find out a lot of people even from the nicknames that they use.
Oh, so is there an industry of people helping people once they find this information? I would think that would be a new industry of people.
Yeah, there is. There's an industry
that are helping people.
There's also bands of volunteers, and the volunteers are known broadly as search angels, and for the most part they're not charging. There are also people you can hire to help you if you are looking for your genetic sister, father, aunt, or if you just want to hire someone to help you do your genealogical research, you can do that. And there's also a lot of Facebook groups that exist where people can just kind of get help and find out information, get tips. So Facebook is kind of lousy with genealogical groups for every kind of type of experience that you can have, or every community that your genes might have hailed from that you're trying to research. So that's a really cool thing. So you can go on there and, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other people have done the research before you.
Whoa. Well, this can really delve into new surprises for you, or new ideas, or your new background, and you get new information about who you actually are. So your book is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking all that time to share it with us tonight, and the time it took you to write it and research it. It's quite interesting, and I encourage everyone to check it out from the library. As I said, we have it in book form, as an audiobook, as an ebook, and you can also purchase it signed from the bookstore that Libby has mentioned. You can also get, just actually, if you want the copy to own, not signed, you can go to Romans in Pasadena. But if you want to get a book signed, you can go to the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And we'll send that out to everyone so that you can get a signed copy or go to Romans or check it out from the Pasadena Public Library. So thank you all so much for attending tonight, this very fascinating program. And I thank Libby very much for all of her time and efforts for the Pasadena Public Library.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. I loved talking to you.
Fascinating subject, and we can just see the amount of your information and your research that you've done on this and your knowledge.
Thank you so much. It's been my
pleasure.
Thank
you very, very much. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. So let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much. I do see that we have one more question. Let's see this next question. Well, basically everybody's just thanking you very much for everything that you've said and your time and effort for us. So thank you so much. Libby, we'll give you all a big round of applause. Thank you so, so much. And I encourage everyone to read the book or do further research as they are interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.